Hey there guys, and welcome back to episode 3 of our now 2020 Avorion Let's Play. Still narrated after the recording, and remember how in the previous episode I ended up not recording enough and ended up with only 5 minutes of episode? Well, this time I recorded almost 2 hours, mostly by accident, and as I write the script for the narration, I still have no clue how much of it is actually going to be relevant to the actual progression of the Let's Play. But there's that. So, first things first, the second ship delivery. So, remember how I said in episode 2 that the amount you get for delivering a single ship seemed very high in comparison to the actual effort you had to put into it? Well, I stand corrected again, because the delivery itself seemed easy enough. I had to fly only a few sectors and then make 2 or 3 jumps. However, since the ship was generated by the game, it was not good. It could barely fly, and I wasn't certain that I had the ability to modify it in any shape or form, and if I did, would it result in some sort of penalty? Getting through the systems to where I had to start jumping was somewhat annoying as it is, but it only got worse when I jumped to a system where pirates were trying to attack the Adventurer, the NPC that gives you the starting missions. An NPC which, by the way, is indestructible and has no weapons. And since I really didn't want to risk flying past them on the chance that I would get shot, I decided to start jumping manually now. I moved my ship behind the closest gate to make sure that I had some cover just in case. I got out of the ship into my drone to scout out ahead, and I found a hidden system. And it even contained one of those Operation Exodus beacons. I grabbed it without really wanting to do it, but since the ship that I was flying was, as we already discussed, not ideal, there was plenty of time for me to just fly around that system and gather resources while the ship's power core decided to recharge along with its drive. What seemed like about 5 minutes later, the ship was ready to jump. I scouted ahead with my drone, got an empty system this time, moved back to the ship, jumped, and poop. Yeah, I didn't even bother trying to save the damn thing. Its jump drive took 276 seconds to recharge, and it had very little to no capacity to even try to outrun the pirates since all of its energy was being used for the jump drive. Yeah, it wasn't happening. I bailed on that ship and the mission, and I was very glad to say at least that the mission only swallowed my credits instead of reputation. Or maybe it did both. I wouldn't know, it didn't tell me. But hey, that's one obligation less, and there were better things to do, such as the idea that I mentioned in my previous episode, where I talked about designing prefab parts for the ship in order to build our future fleet with. But in order to do that, I needed a better mining ship. I went back and bought a mining system that would allow me to mine out hidden resources. For those of you who don't know, the hidden resources usually contain much more material inside of them than the regular rocks you can see around. The obvious problem was that this instantly chewed through all of that tiny little ship's power core. And since I had place to be and things to do, and as already mentioned, I am a man of much restraint, I did, this. So yeah, this is fine. Note to self, replace the solar cells with titanium generators at some point, but to be completely fair, it completely did the job alright. The ship did not seem to have any issues flying, and after I slapped some of those prefab engines on it, and with all of that nonsense behind me, I brought the ship towards the system our main ship was in, as so that I could keep an eye on it just in case the sails were making some sort of issues with the AI trying to navigate around rocks. But as soon as I figured out that that wasn't the case, I settled down next to a station and started working. So the way I wanted to do this at the start was very simple. I created a random block and proceeded to extend a very thin section away from it so that once I was finished designing the part, I could simply select all the blocks related to it and save it. What I first had in mind was a sort of Firefly-esque design where we had 2 main engines on either side at the front of the ship, and the whole idea behind it was that they would be constructed in a way to have their own internal power generation, so that, in theory, no matter how large the size of the engines I picked, they would be fully covered energy-wise. Now, the whole thing was, of course, given an integrity generator as well, and since I wanted this version to use as little titanium as possible, the energy generation itself was handled by a stack of solar panels. I covered the whole thing with, now that I think about it, very thin armor plates for the amount of stuff they need protection, but, well, there we go. This was at this time that I was trying to put the prefab to use, which was, I don't know, maybe I didn't have enough titanium or something, but it really did seem like when I rescale the engine parts of the engine, something would screw up and I wouldn't be able to place it down. Now, since I already started disliking the overall design of that engine as I was building it, I used this as an excuse to just start over. This time, I took the existing prefab that I already had, and I was going to scale it up a little bit. So I started disassembling the old ship. I removed all the old engines, all the cargo pods, until I was left with what is basically the core of the ship, and this is when I was going to simply test the shapes that I could scale for the new prefab engine, since I wanted to make 2 large engines in the front and smaller ones in the rear, and basically this happened. So I've still no clue why the old prefab engines could be scaled without random blocks merging, but I have a feeling that it might be trying to, when sized to certain extremes, attempt to merge similar blocks, which in our case ruins the whole thing. So back to the drawing board. I realized at this point that I had spent almost an hour and a half with nothing to show for it, so I wasn't really happy at all. So, okay, I had disassembled the ship this far, so I took it as an excuse to just finally fix the design. Again. I kept removing some of the back portion of it, as well the solar pyramids that I had made when I didn't have any titanium, until only the central integrity generator remained. I wrapped that up in some armor, just in case, and took the very same cargo containers that I had designed before and started placing them in a much more proper place this time, behind the main section. And to tell you the truth, this design already appeared to me much more fun than what I initially had, so naturally I just kept on going with the new design. My thought that was, if I didn't end up designing those prefabs that I had in mind, at least I would have fixed the ship finally. Next up were the front engines. I decided not to overdo it, since I was already seeing that the generated amount of energy was rather low. I put what I was fully aware would be just a placeholder, and instead focused on the issue that I noticed moments ago, expanding the ship sideways a little bit to make room for more energy generators, containment fields, and later on, after taking a brief test flight, I also decided to go with the suggestion I was given beforehand and put some more inertia dampeners on it, which completely tanked my energy generation again. So back to the editor, adding more generators, and at this point I was very glad that I replaced the titanium cargo hold with iron ones so that I could actually use that reclaimed titanium for more energy generations. But Christ, it was getting a little bit hectic now. But once I saw that this basically doubled my energy capacity, and as I already mentioned thoroughly before, that I'm a man of much restraint, I started adding more engines to it. Again, the rear ones ended up being so large that I actually had to put a fake exhaust on it so that I could hide more integrity field generators behind it. And finally, it was time for a test drive. I flew to the mining ship to see how it was dealing with the fields with its enlarged size, and it seemed that it was perfectly fine, if not for the fact that this system had very little to no titanium in it. I went around looking for an equipment dealer, as I had some room for expanding my existing systems, as well as I could already tell that the ship handled very well without any need for boost, though while the energy was being used for recharging the jump drive, I think the motion dampeners weren't actually working at all, which was a slight problem, but not a immediate issue. Instead, for now, I turned my attention towards the available missions, because not only I needed the credits, but I also wanted to get a feel for the handling of the ship, since it would be best that I figure out any flaws in the settings before I settle closer to the center of the galaxy. The next 15 minutes or so were spent doing just that. A few procurement missions involving fuel, a few minor additions to the ship in terms of energy containers rather than just generators, and a more visually appealing front in the end. This is our current ship. And that really marks the end of episode 3. Really a build-centric session that took much longer than I thought it would be, but in the end I'd say it was a perfectly good one. At the time recording this voiceover and looking over the recorded footage, I think I'm going to go with a more vertical design overall. Until now, most of my ships were designed horizontally, which means that they kind of feel samey for me, and I really want to try something different. But I think this episode has taught me that I can only assume what happens next. Anyway, guys, thanks for joining me in this episode. In the next week, in the next one, I will be trying to provide us with a little bit more progression. I still need to find better system upgrades for our main ship, perhaps make a second miner as well. I'm still not quite sure what I want to make that ship into. Maybe a blockade runner or something, as I've never really focused on trading before. And if we ever find ourselves a smuggler hideout, that too might be an interesting angle to approach the game from for a future episode. But as for now, thanks for joining me in this little adventure, and I'll see you in the next episode. This is Fantasy Dragon aka Syndromes. Fly safe.